Hello. Thanks, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity to share my thoughts with you today. I'm a Maryland artist and professor and small business owner. And as a person who makes art a lot all the time and thinks about art education, I often get a phrase or an idea kind of stuck in my head. And recently, this phrase has been sight unseen. A few years ago, my niece and her husband purchased a house in Louisiana, sight unseen. And I remember thinking, this is such a strange idea, right? To buy a house sight unseen, it's kind of crazy. Now, my husband and I have lived in an area where there are many military families who are much more familiar with this idea and probably much more comfortable with it. But the idea for us of actually doing it, actually going through and buying a house sight unseen, was a little scary, a little strange, and could cause a little anxiety. We started talking about it, and we were saying, what a leap of faith. Buying a house sight unseen. It's one of the biggest investments you can make in your life, and also one of the most rewarding if that house turns out to be a home. That really takes some guts. Now, technically, I know most people do not completely purchase a house sight unseen because they have photographs online. So they have an idea of what they're purchasing. But as an artist and a professor, a business owner, and just a normal person, I'm keenly aware that an image is not necessarily the reality it represents. Sight unseen. That phrase is obvious when you're talking about buying a house. But what does it really mean? And why do I keep thinking about it in relationship to my life and my creative practice? Now, you may not know what a creative practice is. So let me just tell you what it is. A creative practice is simply how an artist organizes their workday. How an artist moves through the day to make room for the good stuff, the time to create, the time to discover something new. It's how we organize our time. It's how we invest our resources and how we cultivate daily habits that support our creative work. And so I think this phrase, sight unseen, may relate to the creative practice somehow. There might be something in there. And that sight unseen might be life, it might be like life in general. And that's what I'm interested in exploring in this talk. Let's just start with the words themselves, sight unseen. S-I-T-E, the first word in that phrase, is defined by a location, a piece of land, a space with a border, a setting to tell a story. As an artist in my creative practice, I've gone to the same sites for many years: St. Mary's River, Mulberry Fields, historic St. Mary's City, all places around Leonardtown. And even though I am an abstract painter, I am in practice an observational artist. I am connected to the places where I work, where I walk, where we raised our family, and where I make art. We've lived in Maryland for 19 years, and that is a really long time for me. I think the longest I've ever lived in one place before that was 5 years. So this connection to place is super important to me, and I believe it's central to all of us as human beings. As an artist, when I work from a specific site, I walk that site and I draw. I sit at that site and I listen. I measure the distance between me and what is seen, and I recall my memories when I get back to the studio. At first, I may only see highlights of a place: fences, paths, a favorite view, a blue heron, but then slowly, as I repeat my steps and trace my way through the space, I begin to know that site differently. My first impressions fade away, and instead, I see a specific tree, an individual river, or a beautiful neon orange construction sign right next to a pink sunset. And those are my favorite days. And as soon as I begin to deeply appreciate and know a site for what is built on top of the land, I look down as I walk, and I'm reminded of all the lives that have walked this land before me. And I feel connected to the ground through my steps. And I begin to know myself in relation to something much, much larger. As I think about this idea, I'm reminded that my place in life, my point of view, is a place of privilege. I'm reminded that if I only choose to experience the views of the water that are available to some and off limits to most, I am only experiencing a sight from one point of view. And I think this habit of looking at things from multiple points of views is unique to artists. And for me, it began as an artist at the New York Studio School. We were trained to stare at a room full of figures, life models that would hold the same pose for the entire class and keep that pose for the entire semester. So we never saw the subjects move, they stayed the same. What changed was our point of view and the solutions that we brought to the canvas. This skill of being able to change my point of view and actively seek out opportunities to do so is dependent on where I physically stand and where I mentally stand. So when I choose to walk in the middle of a peninsula, in between the waterways, I am bound to change my point of view, giving dimension to my experience. And when I walk in the middle of a location or a conversation or an idea, in a flash, just like that, the place or the person that I thought I knew becomes even richer with meaning. I'm reminded that places of poverty and deep abandonment still have sunset views. And I'm reminded that the image of a person I see online may not actually be the reality. When that happens, a sight becomes more than the sum of its parts. A sight becomes a constructed reality that depends on my interaction with it. One of my favorite authors, Anne Truitt, was also a psychologist and an artist and a professor. And she wrote 2 books called Daybook and Turn. And they were diaries of her time as a professor of art at the University of Maryland and her life as an artist on the Eastern Shore. She says in Turn, we dwell as strangers on the earth to become its rack. We invent ourselves. We name it land and sea and sky, and we divide its reaches arbitrarily into degrees of latitude and longitude, supplemented by a contrivance we call time. That really resonates with me, that quote and those books. I read them all a lot in my studio. And when I walk a site repeatedly, I learn something new, and I go back to my studio and I begin again, translating my experience into a new visual poetic form. Each time I start a new canvas, I am reinventing a site, knowing I am also in the process of reinventing myself. And by thinking about my creative practice and how these words sight unseen might relate, I realize that in addition to using the tool of changing my perspective, I'm also repeating my actions, like walking, tracing, researching, and looking, using these actions to help me know each site from the inside out. I began to see that a site is more than just a location. It's a place with a history and a community, a place where I have a responsibility. Unseen, the second word in that phrase, is defined as not directly evident, invisible, not predicted or planned, not noticeable. And when you hear it, unseen sounds like there's nothing to see, like it's an inactive word. But maybe I'm thinking it's more like a verb. It's an interactive word, meaning to be unseen requires someone or many people to look away. To unsee means you have to move really fast, click on a new tab, and go from here to there at top speed. And we all do this, right? If you're in a city and you're trying to cross the street, you have to shut out the visual noise to get from here to there just to survive, right? So you have to put on blinders to focus on your goal, to focus what is directly in front of you instead of what is all around you. Certainly our life, our screen life is like this. Screens provide a focal point, into a digital world defined by a rectangular border. And if we choose, and we all choose, our brains can edit, sort, rationalize, ignore whole parts of our visual experience. Unseen also means not predicted or planned. That means we can't predict the outcome and we can't control it. We are not in control. As an art professor, what I'm describing actually translates into something quite literal in the studio. I'm sure you've seen artists close one eye and kind of put their hand up like this and shut out the perspective from the other eye. And I'm sure you've used your own camera on your phone to focus in on a loved one, get rid of all the noise around so you can get a close-up of a portrait. But in order to teach students to really see, I actively encourage students to unsee and ignore nothing. In order to teach them to reevaluate what they think they know, I encourage them to look down, look up, look out, look far, and look in between. I have them draw from the sides of their eyes rather than depict what's in front of them. In fact, I use a quote in my class by John Muir, who said, "The astronomer looks high and the geologist looks low, but who looks in between on the surface of the earth?" I think he had an artist in mind. In nearly all of our endeavors, artists have to tend to, nurture, and cultivate the space between what they see and what they know. They have to unsee. What happens when those two words, sight unseen, become a phrase? If sight is a noun, a place or something or someone that is more than the sum of its parts, and it has a history and a community, then it becomes a constructed reality that depends on my interaction with it. And unseen is a verb that requires active observation by a person with the knowledge that they can't predict an outcome or have control. So sight unseen must be a multi-dimensional noun verb thing that completely catches our undivided attention, and its success and its growth is dependent on our interaction with it and our sense of responsibility to it. Sight unseen is a constructed reality that requires a full investment of time and money and emotion, where we can't predict the outcome and have no control. When I say that out loud, it sounds a lot like life. And life can be hard to buy into sometimes because it's complicated and messy and has history and happens whether we want it to or not. The picture of life in our head rarely matches the reality. It also provides no guarantees on how the story will end. So how do you take that leap to buy into life, a sight unseen? If you're an artist, you know that artists take the opportunity to invest in a sight unseen every time they walk into the studio. Our canvases are blank, our narratives haven't been filmed, our virtual worlds haven't been created. And yet we invest time and money and our emotions without knowing what the outcome will be. And when I say that also out loud, it sounds like not such a great idea, but it does feel familiar. It feels a lot like what I feel like being a parent, and I'm sure that other parents in the audience can relate to that. We recently drove our oldest child 7 hours away to attend college, and a few weeks ago, we watched our youngest child walk into a high school with almost 4,000 kids. I don't know about you, but we have invested a lot of time and money and emotion into our children, into those two beautiful beings, without knowing what the outcome will be. And as parents, it's terrifying to look at where you might have failed, and exciting to revel in your successes, and freeing when you realize your children are actually writing their own stories. Now, remember, I'm an artist, a parent, and a small business owner, and an academic. I've spent the last 25 years as an artist in higher education, and let me tell you that academics hold the record for wanting the answers before they have tried the solution. So I'm in constant battle with myself. They are risk averse like people. We want to name, label, categorize, predict outcomes to decrease our chances of failure. But that's not what artists do. Artists seek new unknown experiences and opportunities. Artists do not want to predict an exact outcome, because part of understanding a new experience and translating that to others involves buying into a sight unseen and using every tool in the toolbox to feel confident about it. One tool that every artist employs is active observation. Artists have to actively look at the world around them, which ends up being, as shocking as it sounds, not just a bed of roses. It's hard to stare directly into an imperfect world. It requires a steady commitment to slow down, and at times it feels uncomfortable. At times it might even feel dangerous. If you're a woman in the room, you know you were taught not to stare, not to confront, not to really see. So active observation also requires bravery to look at the mistakes as well as the successes. This idea, what it means to buy a sight unseen, is central to everything I teach and everything that I know to be true as an artist and as a human being. Let me just circle around back to close this off to the house metaphor. Say you have to buy a house, you have to move quickly and you buy it online. When you get to the site with where your perfect house sits, you realize it is imperfect. You failed to notice that the photographer used a wide-angle lens and that the rooms are actually much smaller. And you couldn't have noticed that the quiet street in the pictures was actually a thoroughfare that runs parallel to one of the busiest streets in the town. And you realize the national ranking for the state schools that you signed your kids up for didn't apply to your county because it's underfunded and the school is overcrowded. And you know this is an imperfect situation. And if this situation hasn't exactly happened to you, I'm sure something similar has, where you have ended up feeling cheated or ripped off, or worse, angry or sad. And I think about this in relation to the pandemic, because the pandemic is a collective experience. All feel a bit cheated or ripped off. The pandemic was a collective sight unseen. We've read about them, we've seen movies about them, and the reality is nothing could have prepared us for what we're experiencing. And guess what? We've already made the purchase. We're in. We've invested the time, the money, and the emotions into our lives. And we're not in charge, and we don't have control. And so with that knowledge, it might be really hard for a lot of people to re-engage. It might be hard for people to invest again. I want to suggest that embedded in the creative practice of artists, there are some helpful tools. When you start actively observing, looking beyond surface information about a house, a job, a child, or an assignment, you begin to think like an artist and you have the energy to re-engage. When you start purposefully changing your point of view, seeking opportunities to gain a new experience, perspective, you learn something new and you begin to think like an artist. And when you dig deeper into a place and you learn about it as if you were personally invested, as if the people who walked with you were your friends and neighbors and family, you begin to think like an artist. So if you start to cultivate a habit of using those 3 artistic tools I mentioned, active observation, seeking new opportunities to change your point of view, and investing in and honoring the responsibility to place, you will begin to be ready to buy into a life sight unseen. Thank you for your time.